We all know that there are many people living in New York who don't have any health insurance. What is less well understood is that many of those people aren't unemployed or destitute. They're working, sometimes for large, profitable companies. But many of those companies have chosen not to offer health insurance, with the result that when some of their employees get sick, they take advantage of taxpayer-financed public health services. Is this fair? What should be done about it? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is USA Inc. Joining us today is Josh Mason, Policy Director for the Working Families Party, a political party aimed at representing the interests of lower and middle-income families. Josh, thanks for being on the show with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
There's a bill now being considered in Albany called the Fair Share for Health Care Act. I believe was put forward by your own party. Can you give us a little background about why you put that forward and what it's all about?
Sure. We've thought for a while, ever since we passed the minimum wage at the end of 2004.
You mean the increase?
The increase in the minimum wage, that's right. That was, for the first part of our party's history, that was our #1 priority, getting an increase in the state minimum wage. And once we'd won that, we all sort of recognized that the next big issue for working people in New York State had to be health care. Whether you're talking about union members, low-income people, communities of color, suburbanites, everybody is struggling with health care. And so the challenge then became, how do we approach this? And there's a lot of approaches. I think we, like a lot of people on the left in our ideal world, would love to see, some type of single-payer, universal public program. But we decided after some painful discussions that in New York State, at this point, that simply wasn't a realistic thing to be striving for, and we wanted something that we could actually achieve. And so what we finally arrived at was this notion of fair share, the idea that large businesses should be required to pay a reasonable amount for their employees' health benefits. And so that's what the Fair Share for Healthcare bill does. As it's currently written, it says that any business with more than 100 workers in New York State must pay an amount sufficient to provide them with health benefits. Now, we've defined that amount right now as $3 per worker per hour, although obviously any particular dollar figure is going to be a little arbitrary, and that's something that's under negotiation. But the basic principle is that if you are a big business, if you are, Walmart or Target, if you're Columbia University, if you're, the Empire State Building, you are able to provide health care for your employees, you have the financial resources to do that, and you have a moral responsibility to do that. And we think it's really in the interest of New York State that we require employers to do that, because right now we have a dynamic where many employers provide health benefits and a few don't, and they're undermining our system of employment-based health care. They're driving up costs for the rest of us, and they're really in large measure responsible for the crisis of uninsurance in the state today.
Well, let's break this down now into sort of some bite-sized pieces. First of all, what's the scope of the problem? How many big companies are there out there who aren't offering health care insurance?
We have close to 3 million people in this state without health insurance, and 80% of those people, 4 in 5, are in working families. In other words, they are either employed themselves or they're the dependents of somebody who is employed.
And can you figure out what percentage of those are working for large companies that don't
Yes,
offer
unfortunately, it's not the majority. We think that probably a little over 500,000 of the uninsured are working for large businesses. The businesses
that aren't providing health insurance. So
typically, in almost every case, they're providing health insurance for somebody, but they're not providing health insurance for all their workers. They may be providing health insurance for managers, or in the case of Walmart, for somebody who's been there for an extended period of time. But many large businesses don't provide health care for a large proportion of their workers, and we think that accounts for maybe 500,000 of the uninsured in New York State. So, not the majority of them, but that's still a lot of people. Now, most of the uninsured work for small businesses, and it's hard to reach them through a fair share approach, and we're going to need to do something else to reach those people.
Well,
so we recognize we're just biting off a piece of the problem here.
My next question was, you started out by saying we want to make sure that large employers pay their fair share, which I think is a concept many people can get their arms around. But then when you define large as 100 employees or up, I think that might capture businesses that many people don't think of as being so
It's
large.
interesting you say that, because some people have responded that way, but other people have responded in exactly the opposite way. There are people who think that 50 would be a better and more reasonable standard.
How did you pick the number?
We picked it through a combination of factors. We looked at businesses. We started out, I should say, we've actually passed this type of legislation before. We passed a bill in Suffolk County, and we supported a bill that other groups, particularly Jobs with Justice, really led the fight on in New York City. So there are two bills already in New York State that have been passed and acted into law that are based on the same principle. They're narrower. They only apply in the retail sector.
Only in retail?
But
all size companies? Or?
They have size thresholds that are a little bit different. I don't want to go into the details, but it can be based on things like sales and square feet as well as the number of employees. But it's basically the same notion of targeting large retailers, but basically big box stores and groceries. But the notion there was to start with sectors where you actually did have a lot of employers providing decent benefits, so you know it's possible. You know the economics of the industry allows it to happen. But where you've got some employers, and this is, obviously where Walmart is Exhibit A, that are coming into these industries not providing decent health benefits and undermining, an arrangement that was actually working pretty well in providing health insurance to most of the workers in these industries.
So there's an equity issue here for you.
And we picked, so getting back to the question of why 100, if you look at the reality of health insurance in New York, and I think it's pretty similar in most of the country, if you look at really small businesses, they typically aren't providing health benefits, and I think the reality is it's very difficult for a lot of them to do so. If you look at larger businesses, you're talking about 85% of the workers at these businesses are already eligible for health benefits, so we don't think it's so unreasonable to single out the relatively small number of employers who aren't providing insurance in the larger in the larger businesses. So that's so the short answer is we think 100 is a number where it actually becomes realistic to say these businesses can afford to provide health benefits.
What kind of reaction have you had in Albany with politicians? It's
been remarkably positive. If anything, on the Assembly side, there's people who would like to go a lot farther than we're going. But on the Senate side, it certainly is not wholly negative. I'm sure you've seen that the Majority Leader, Joseph Bruno, has been quoted saying that it is not right that some large businesses aren't providing health benefits. It's not right that we've got people working for hugely profitable companies that are enrolled in public health programs. And he said that he thinks that some version of this might well pass this year.
I mean, I think the issue for a taxpayer is, what is a big equity issue of how is it fair that a company like a Walmart of that size, with that level of profitability, is not offering health insurance, and so they end up on the public's payroll. I mean, I think that's the key point.
That's right. A moment ago I said we think it's about 500,000 workers at these large businesses who don't have insurance, and the number we would cover would be slightly lower than that, maybe 400,000 who we think could actually gain health insurance as a result of this bill. But there's another 200,000 people working for these same group of large businesses who are currently enrolled in Medicaid and Family Health Plus. And that's actually extremely costly to the taxpayers. It's probably in excess of $1 billion a year that we taxpayers are spending to provide health insurance to people who work at these mainly very large, very profitable corporations. And obviously we don't want to throw these people off the public rolls. As the governor has seen the same problem, said, the solution is to just not let these people get Medicaid. Well, obviously that's the wrong answer. But we do think that it's perfectly reasonable to ask these people's employers to pay their share and not pass those costs off to the taxpayers, not pass those costs off to the rest of us.
Now, people are unhappy with this bill as well as happy, so let's talk about the detractors. What are their main complaints? Well,
the biggest complaint is, of course, this is going to kill jobs. It's too expensive for business. It's bad for the business climate. Every time you try to do anything, that's what you're going to hear. And, I think that those complaints are not well-founded. I think that we've seen over and over again historically that you introduce some new requirement to provide workers with some new benefit, whether it's a minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and businesses scream and yell they're not going to be able to afford this, and we find that actually they can't afford it. In fact, we think this bill would be a net creator of jobs in New York State. We admit that it's possible that some low-wage, inefficient businesses would simply not be able to function if they had to provide decent health benefits. And frankly, we think that those businesses probably should not exist. If you cannot find a way of making money with the level of talented, skilled, dedicated workers we have in New York without paying them more than $8 an hour, maybe you shouldn't be in business.
That's a pretty harsh statement, isn't it? I mean, if I was in business and heard you say that, I think I'd feel like, well, you try it. It's not so easy.
I think that the reality is that that's a very small group of businesses. The vast majority of businesses, let's keep in mind, are already providing decent benefits. We're targeting a relatively limited group that are not doing so. And if there are some job losses, there'll be job gains in other areas. When you pay people more, if you provide people more health benefits, they use more healthcare services, and healthcare is one of our biggest and most rapidly expanding industries here in New York.
So the expansion in employment would come in the healthcare industry?
That's right. We think, based on the studies we've done, and we commissioned a study that used a very conservative estimate of job loss, an estimate of job loss that we honestly think is too high, but we wanted to give our critics, in some ways, the benefit of the doubt there and say, okay, suppose everything you say is true about job loss. Now let's just try to do an assessment of how many new jobs are created when you spend, X number of hundreds of millions of more dollars on health benefits. And it turns out that however you look at it, you're creating more jobs in the healthcare sector than you are losing in low-wage businesses. So I think that, if anything, it's a net plus for the economy.
Are there any examples of that we could look at around the country just to sort of reassure ourselves that what you're saying is true?
Honestly, we're in somewhat uncharted territory here. We're pushing the envelope here. There have been, Maryland passed a similar bill, but it was much narrower in scope and it hasn't gone into effect yet. The Massachusetts bill, which I guess we may discuss a little later, people think that they've done a similar analysis there where they think it's going to be a net creator of jobs because of new spending on healthcare. But again, it's something that just passed. There isn't a track record. We do have a similar example though, which is the minimum wage. Many states around the country, including New York State, have increased their state level minimum wage, which, just like fair share, increases the cost of labor to business. So if there were very clear impact from increased costs of labor on job creation, on employment, we would be seeing that by now. We would be seeing job loss in states with higher minimum wages. And it just isn't there. No matter how you slice it, it's just not there. New York State, since we increased our state minimum wage, has seen faster job growth than in the preceding 2 years, seen faster job growth than in neighboring states that did not raise their minimum wage, and it's seen faster job growth specifically in the sectors that are most impacted by the minimum wage. Retail, fast food, hospitality, sectors with very high proportion of minimum wage workers not only are not losing jobs, they're actually gaining them faster than in states that didn't raise their minimum wage. So
there's so many other factors. How do you isolate it?
Of course. I'm not saying that minimum wage increases actually create jobs. I'm saying that any job loss effect is so small that it's swamped by all the other factors. To think that this is going to have a dramatic or even a noticeable effect on employment, if you look at the example of minimum wage, the evidence just isn't there.
Okay. We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Josh Mason, Policy Director for the Working Families Party. Would everyone in New York State be affected by this, or you have some carve-outs that protect certain industries?
We have some carve-outs. In addition to limiting the bill to businesses with more than 100 workers, as we talked about before, we exclude two specific sectors, manufacturing and agriculture. And the reason for that is that part of the notion of this bill is establishing a level playing field. We think it's much easier, if we are asking businesses to pay more for health care, we think it's much easier to do that if all their competitors are paying more too. And for most of the industries that don't provide decent benefits, things like hospitality, retail, food service, they're competing with other businesses in the state. And so if they're all raising their healthcare spending at once, at worst you're talking about an extra nickel for your hamburger. And I think most of us think that's worth it if we can really help deal with the problem of uninsured workers. But these two industries, manufacturing and agriculture, are different because they compete nationally or even internationally. And so we worry that rather than creating a level playing field, we'll simply be in some ways making the cost disadvantage that these businesses already have even worse. We think, although as I was saying before, we think in general the fears of job loss are greatly overblown. They're more plausible when it comes to these industries in globalized markets like manufacturing and agriculture than they are in other types of industries. And the other reason we excluded them is because they're concentrated in some of the most economically depressed areas of the state, upstate, and in western New York. And both politically, obviously, that becomes a huge issue, and that's obviously, but there may also be a substantive issue there that in New York City, where we have a strong economy but huge disparities between rich and poor, the biggest problem we face is the problem of the working poor. And that's the sort of problem this bill is designed to address. In areas upstate, and the suburbs are a similar situation in many ways. A great deal of inequality in the context of fairly strong economies overall. Upstate is different. And, the same solution that applies here is not necessarily the right solution there. And, is this the ideal compromise? Probably not, but we think it was the best way to not weaken the bill too much while respecting the legitimate concerns of people, in Western New York and upstate.
Now, you mentioned, I think, the Maryland bill, which specifically is really aiming at Walmart, and they've said 1,000 employees and higher would
10,000.
Is it 10,000? I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Even more of a disparity with your proposal. Presumably they thought about a lot of the same issues. Why would it be 10,000 in Maryland and 100 in New York?
To be honest, their bill, and I've talked to a lot of the people who worked on that bill. I've gotten their advice on this bill. We work closely with them. But their bill is a symbolic bill. Their bill is not intended in itself to deal with the problem of people without insurance, workers without insurance.
It's intended.
It's a symbolic issue to concentrate attention on Walmart and other big businesses that aren't doing their part, to turn this into a winning political issue, to energize people, to set the stage for broader reform. But it's not in itself intended to actually do much in terms of getting more people insurance.
Well, let's talk about a state that is certainly trying to grapple with that, which would be Massachusetts. They've gotten a lot of applause for the bill that they recently passed. Can you talk about the differences between what Massachusetts is going for and what this bill is aiming at?
Massachusetts is an interesting case. I mean, the very positive thing about Massachusetts is they really have put the issue on the agenda. They've laid out a marker that says it is the responsibility of state government to do something about the number of people without insurance. And that's a great thing, and I think that's going to help reform all over the country, including in New York. That said, if you look at the specifics of their bill, it's not the approach that we would want to take here in New York. Essentially, if you want to do something about health insurance, well, you can totally revamp our system, turn it into a Canadian system if you want to. But if you're not going to do that, and we don't think we're in a position to do that, then you can't. Then somebody's going to have to pay more for the expansion of coverage. You're not going to be able to dramatically control costs, and so if you want more people to be covered, somebody's going to have to pay for it. Well, who can pay for it? There's really only three groups that can pay for it. Either business can pay for it, taxpayers can pay for it, or individuals can pay for it. Well, in Massachusetts, they basically let business off scot-free. They have this very minimal, less than $300 per year that businesses that don't offer health insurance would have to pay. And they can get out of paying even that if they simply offer insurance. Nobody has to even take it up. So basically, businesses are getting off scot-free in Massachusetts. So who's going to have to pay? Individuals or the taxpayers? Well, to be honest, they didn't answer that question. They deferred that question. They said, well, individuals will have to buy insurance, so it sounds like it's on individuals, but that won't go into effect until there's some low-cost insurance option for them to buy. And where is that low-cost insurance option going to come from? How much of a subsidy will it require? How much will it cost the state? They're leaving those questions for somebody else to answer down the road. So in some ways, I saw one lawmaker in Massachusetts describe it as a Hail Mary pass. They really, they don't know they don't know how it's going to get worked out, but they felt that they had to try something. And, I certainly understand that impulse, but I think we can do better here in New York. I think that we can actually tell business that they have to contribute to solving this problem too. We don't need to give them a free pass the way they did in Massachusetts.
There are some people that would say we've gone too far to the other extreme, though, and certainly in New York City, one hears constant complaining about all the variety of business taxes and that this is the most expensive city in the country to do business in, and New York State is close to the most expensive state. And won't having $3 an hour per worker as a tax, essentially?
It's not a tax. This is important. I think there's a lot of confusion. I want to clear this up. What we're talking about is a minimum amount that you have to spend on health benefits. If you're already spending that amount on health benefits, you don't pay anything more under this bill. So it's not, the Business Council did their analysis. Actually, they farmed it out to some professor at the University of Kentucky, who I understand has a sort of regular sideline in this kind of thing. But he analyzed this thing as if we were proposing a new $3 per hour tax on business. And he said, well, that would be a bad idea. Well, we agree, that would be a bad idea. But it's not what we're doing. We're setting a minimum level of expenditure, and the majority of businesses that are already providing decent health benefits aren't going to have to spend one additional penny under this bill. We're targeting a relatively small group of businesses that aren't doing their part.
What about the Massachusetts impetus to ask individuals who can afford to pay? I mean, there are many people who are making, let's say, $40,000 a year who they're young, they figure they're going to live forever, and they don't bother to take health insurance on?
I think that's, I don't know, I haven't seen the statistics in Massachusetts. I think that's probably not your typical uninsured person in New York. But I also think it's not realistic to think you're going to solve the problem that way. Even an individual, insurance policy could cost you, what, $4,000, $5,000 a year. If you're an individual making $40,000 a year, I just don't think you're going to be able to afford that. And many of the uninsured are not individuals. They're people with families, with children. Massachusetts, their individual mandate says if you are earning, I believe it's over 3 times the poverty level, you are responsible for the full cost of your health benefits. So for a family of 3, say a single mother with 2 kids, if she's earning $48,000 a year, she is going to be responsible under law for buying at full cost a health insurance policy. I'm telling you, you cannot buy health insurance for a family of 3 on an income of $48,000. You cannot do it. So saying we're going to solve the health insurance problem that way, as I said, it's a Hail Mary pass. They know it's not going to work. They hope something will come along to make it work. They hope that some new pot of federal money will show up so they can subsidize these plans. Or I don't know what they're hoping, but you cannot solve the problem by putting the cost onto individuals. Individuals just can't pay it.
Is there a possibility that insurance companies will come up with new products that'll be more affordable because there'll be this new pool of entrants coming into the...
The only way you can do that is if you drastically cut back benefits. And I'll tell you, there's a very coherent, conservative approach to health care. I don't agree with it, but it's a very logical and consistent approach. This says, first of all, we need individual mandates. Secondly, we need bare bones, catastrophic coverage plans. And third, we need health savings accounts. And the notion of all these is basically individual responsibility. There are many people, and not only on the political right, many people, respectable people who say, the problem with our healthcare system is that healthcare is free to the individual. And so they consume too much of it, or they consume the wrong kind of it. They go to the emergency room because they're feeling lonely. So if that's what you believe, you want to make the individual actually see the cost of the healthcare they're consuming. And that's what these approaches are supposed to do. But if you believe that the problem that we have with healthcare in this country is that individuals are making bad choices, they're consuming too much healthcare, and they're making bad choices because they have the wrong financial incentives, then this conservative approach of individual mandates, HSAs, catastrophic policies, which could be cheaper, is a good approach. But I don't believe that. I don't think most people, if they just use their common sense about how they interact with the healthcare system, I don't think they believe that. And if you don't believe that's the problem, then cheap, catastrophic health insurance policies are not the solution.
One of the things that is interesting to me about this bill is that it does have bipartisan support. How hard was it to get a Republican to sign on to this?
It was not easy, and we're desperate to get more than one Republican signed on to it, believe me. But
much has been made of the fact that I think in his district, in his last election, he won by a very narrow margin.
18 votes.
18 votes?
18 votes.
And how many registered voters do you have in his district?
A lot more than that.
Yeah. So how much pressure was he under to sign this?
Well, I would not want to say that he's on this bill through a political deal. If you look at his track record, Senator Spano has been one of the most liberal Republicans in New York politics for a long time. Obviously, the fact that we have political leverage here, the fact that we do have a line on the ballot, the fact that we're able to mobilize a lot of voters makes a difference. I wouldn't say it doesn't, but I don't want you to go away thinking from this that Spano is just another Republican who's just doing this because he's trying to, get some additional votes. Of course he wants the votes, but he's also somebody who's got a pretty pro-labor track record. And
any sign of any others joining him?
I don't want to put out anybody's name out there until, they're ready to be out there officially. But we are certainly talking with a number of other folks in the Republican caucus in the Senate and are pretty optimistic that we'll have some more sponsors fairly soon.
And the next steps?
Well, there's going to be a hearing in the Assembly next week, and we hope that will really help get people's attention focused on this, squeeze out some of the wrinkles that are still there. And we're hoping to schedule a hearing in the Senate not too long after that. We obviously need to have some more Senate sponsors, and at some point we're going to, what we're really doing here is not, the grassroots side of this. We've got people in half a dozen key Senate districts around the state knocking on doors every single day. We've generated hundreds and hundreds of handwritten letters, thousands of phone calls. we're
beating the bushes. Yeah.
Right, that's right. We're not going to win this thing in Albany. We're going to win this thing, out in the districts, out in the field, when we can convince enough ordinary New Yorkers that this is a solution.
Well, stay tuned. I've been fortunate to have Policy Director of the Working Families Party, Josh Mason, as my guest. Thank you, Josh, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
For years, our politicians in Washington have been unable to reach any consensus about what to do about the 45 million Americans who are living without health insurance. It is no surprise that in this vacuum, state legislators have decided to try their hand at a solution. Recently, Massachusetts passed the most sweeping health care coverage legislation in the country. It found a creative way to force over 95% of its residents to get coverage in a financially responsible way. New Yorkers now have an option in front of them, a bill proposed by the Working Families Party that has received bipartisan support in Albany. It is unlikely that it'll pass in its current form. It imposes too steep a financial burden on too many small and mid-sized companies to be politically or economically feasible. However, it does help further an important debate, and it at least is moving us in the right direction. If Massachusetts can do it, why can't we? For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.